Give it a minute to connect. And there it goes, it's recording. So hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for this month's virtual Wildlife Wednesday presentation on harbor porpoises. And Dr. Tobin, can you hit next? So couple guidelines for this, and again, I'll explain. We had some, apparently GCI went down statewide. I'm running off of GCI and Dr. Tobin has a different internet connector. So in case I disappear off the face of the earth, hopefully Dr. Tobin can keep going if it goes down again. But I'm going to talk for a minute about our virtual engagement guidelines. Obviously no Zoom bombing. We have everybody set up to have their video and their microphone turned off. It helps us increase the bandwidth, and we really need this. We really need that bandwidth to keep everything going. We really encourage viewing in full screen mode. And if you want to ask a question, those are encouraged. Please use the chat. The questions will come to me, and then I will ask Dr. Tobin the questions at the end of the presentation. Most importantly, everybody just enjoy and learn something new. Next. Next slide. So for those of you who don't know who we are, we're Alaska Wildlife Alliance. We're an Alaska-based nonprofit protecting Alaska's wildlife since 1978 through citizen mobilization, advocacy, and education. Please go out to our website at www.akwildlife.org and take a little look at it and see what you think. It's really a good organization. Other ways you can support us is through Facebook. We have a Facebook site, Amazon Smile, the Roundup app, Pick, Click, Give, and the CFC. Next, please. Again, this kind of gives you one of the screens you might see if you went out to alaskawildlife.org. One of the things we do in these wildlife presentations is to try and give just a little bit of an update on some of the things that have been happening and that the Wildlife Alliance has been working on. And so one of the things that I want to talk today about is a sort of an update on the Kenai rule, some really good information about the Kenai rule. For those of you that don't know what that is, it was a special rule to roll back protections for wildlife in the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge right here on the peninsula. And some of the things that they're trying to do is to allow bear baiting for brown bears and to sort of really reduce trapping restrictions in the Ski-Lac Loop area and all through the refuge. Next slide, please. This is, so the yellow outline on the map shows what the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge is. It's a huge wildlife refuge in this area, and it's one of the most popular places for people to go in Alaska. So we're very protective down here of the rules guarding and our conservation within the refuge. They just recently had a rule hearing, and I'm happy to report that 44,000 people commented on the rule making. We think a majority of those were against it for the brown bear baiting and that kind of thing. Something that happened just recently is that a federal court ruled to uphold the ban on brown bear baiting in the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge and maintain that the Ski-Lac Wildlife Recreation Area is managed for wildlife viewing and education only. AWA staff and board are so excited to celebrate this victory for the Kenai brown bears. What's one thing got to do with the other? Well, in 2016, these rules were passed that said you couldn't bait for brown bears. The trapping regulations were implemented and were very strict. Several different things happened in 2016, I think it was. The state of Alaska and Safari International sued to try and remove the restrictions, particularly for brown bear baiting. And that has been winding its way through the courts, and that is what the federal court upheld, really was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's right to manage this refuge in protection of the brown bears in particular. And so this is very exciting. It doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the Kenai rule, because that was a rule that they're trying to implement more recently. But one step at a time, we've really kind of overcome the fight against the original rule, I guess you would say. And I hope I'm saying this to where it makes sense. If it doesn't, just throw it in the chat box and I'll either get you the right answer or whatever. But we want to thank the trustees of Alaska who represented this issue in the court, and the coalition partners who helped to bring about this victory. We also really want to thank the members we have today on the call. Donations made it work. The court, the trustees of Alaska made it work, and the many thousands of people who commented against this rule, most recently for the Kenai rule, is who are going to change the attempts to try and allow brown baiting on the refuge. Next slide. Again, if you go out to the website, I posted just a few of the prior virtual Wildlife Wednesdays that have been provided. Those are all on videotape, and you can go out to our website and take a look at some of them if you hadn't seen them before. The most recent one that you see at the bottom is what you need to know about upcoming trapping season on the Kenai Peninsula, through our executive director, Nicole Schmidt, and through John Morton, one of our board members, really goes into what the Kenai rule is and how it would make changes on the peninsula. Upcoming next month on December 16th is a behind the scenes at the Alaska Sea Life Center. Haley Warner from the Alaska Sea Life Center has agreed to come and talk to us about the rescues that they've done in this last year. And then the ones that they are tracking, she's going to tell us where they are and how far they've made it down the coast and that sort of thing. Next slide. Okay, here we are. I'd like to introduce Dr. Deb Tobin. She's going to be the presenter today for The Secret Life of Harbor Porpoises. Dr. Tobin has been a biology professor at the Kachemak Bay Campus of Kenai Peninsula College, UAA, Anchorage for over 14 years. She's a behavioral ecologist who specializes in aquatic mammals in the nearshore and marine environment. She is also the local lead in Homer for the Sea Life Center's Marine Mammal Stranding Network, and occasionally serves as a naturalist aboard wildlife cruises along the Baja Mexico Peninsula. That sounds fun. 10 years ago, she co-developed the nationally renowned Semester by the Bay program at KPC in Homer, which brings in students from around Alaska and the lower 48. During the Semester by the Bay, students participate in experiential learning field courses and conduct internships with various governmental and NGO community partners in marine biology each fall semester and conservation ecology each spring semester. Her past and current, often undergraduate-centered research involves photo identification as well as social organization and communication in beluga whales, bottlenose and spotted dolphins, and soon harbor porpoises, giant river and sea otters, and she assists local friends with their humpback and killer whale research. I'm proud to introduce Dr. Deb Tobin.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and welcome everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Teresa or someone just let me know. Yeah,
yep, I hear you just
yep. Terrific, thank you. Very good to know. So welcome everyone. I see a few names of folks on the list of Zoom attendees that I know and many that I don't know. So if you all have any questions at any point in time, do please put questions or comments in the chat, and Teresa will field those at the end for us. You're also welcome to contact me after this is over if you have other questions that we don't get to, and I'm happy to share my email address with you that way. I just want to give a little shout out to a few folks from the Homer area who I see on the list, as well as some people I know on the peninsula and up in Anchorage and elsewhere, and Allison Gardell, who is down in Tacoma, and my friend Mabella, who spent a semester or almost a semester here with us from England, and she's been back in England for a few years, but she came to help us with the sea otter strandings and some sea otter rescue events that we had here in Homer a few years ago. So welcome everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about some new research that we have started in Kachemak Bay, and also cue you in on the little that we do know about harbor porpoises. And as you'll soon see, there is not much that we know, although we are luckily getting to know them more and more with recent technology, and especially in other parts around the world in their range, which I'll mention here briefly in just a bit, but we'll mostly focus on those sightings that we've had in Cook Inlet and specifically in Kachemak Bay and in Lower Cook Inlet. So these guys, let me first quickly point out to you. So there's a couple here in this image on the title slide. And this is more often than not all you see of a harbor porpoise. And if you see that much, you're kind of lucky. They are incredibly elusive, unlike some other species of Dall's porpoise, for example, or many of the related dolphins. They sort of like a beluga whale, they come to the surface for a very brief period of time, but faster usually than a beluga whale, and then they're gone. And you might see them once or twice at the surface and then they disappear. Even if you're traveling in the same direction on a boat, you might not see them again. So really, with recent drone technology and a lot of studies that folks are doing off of bridges in San Francisco Harbor, or Bay, excuse me, and in Nova Scotia, and in a few other places where they have been able to study them from a permanent platform up above them, or with drones, and then also with acoustics, which I'll talk a little bit about here in a minute. We're starting to get a slightly better handle on what this species actually might be doing the majority of the time when they are underwater. So let me started here. Okay, so first off, what is a porpoise? I'm going to start sort of very broad and bring it in to Halibut Cove Lagoon, where we mostly study harbor porpoises here outside of the in Kachemak Bay, across from Homer. So a porpoise, as you can see here, there are a few wonderful images comparing a porpoise to a dolphin, and the dolphin is actually not the closest member that the 7 extant porpoises of that are current today around the world are related to. Actually, beluga whales and narwhals are more closely related to porpoises, but a lot of people think a porpoise and a dolphin are the same thing. And while they are very closely related, there are a few discernible characteristics that we see in porpoises and not in dolphins. First of all, most of the time, you'll see that dolphins have a very noticeable beak, like you see here, and hopefully you can see my pointer encircling that beak. We call that a rostrum, and that rostrum or beak is pronounced on a dolphin, but is blunt, and there's just sort of the forehead goes straight down on a porpoise. Again, typically, because there are exceptions to this on both sides. And in the porpoises, you have typically very triangular shaped dorsal fins, and in the dolphins, you'll see a falcate, or a more traditional sort of shark-shaped or curved dorsal fin. So those are typically what you'll see at the surface. If there are ways for you to tell. In Alaska, the main way to tell is that we rarely, if ever, see dolphins. We do occasionally, I know of several anecdotal reports from the 80s and 90s of Pacific white-sided dolphins in Kachemak Bay, but we rarely see dolphins in this area. So most likely what you're seeing is a harbor porpoise or a Dall's porpoise. When we look at their teeth and their skull overall, you can see quite a few differences here as well. Overall, dolphin skulls tend to be larger, porpoises tend to be smaller. And the tooth, if you see a dolphin tooth, has a typical pointed curvature to it or structure to it, and they are uniform throughout. Whereas we see in porpoises, you have these very curved or blade-like, flattened spatula-like teeth. And again, similar throughout. They don't have different dentition in different locations around their jaws like we do. So there are 7 different porpoises around the world. There will be a quiz at the end. No, I'm kidding. But here is a nice graphic that shows the different porpoises around the world. And again, the ones that we see here are the harbor porpoise in the upper right of the image here, and the Dall's porpoise. And you can see that this is not an exaggeration. The Dall's porpoises are very thick, chunky, robust, musculature, amazing animals, probably one of my favorite species, but they are quite easy to distinguish from a harbor porpoise if you are in an area like in Seward, where you might likely see them both out in Resurrection Bay. So not just the coloration, but some of their behavior. Porpoises or harbor porpoises tend to be elusive, like I mentioned, but also usually avoid boats, whereas Dall's porpoises oftentimes will bow ride, and in the wake behind or in front of a boat, they will oftentimes approach a moving vessel and spend time near it, whereas harbor porpoises tend to do the opposite. All of these 7 species are in the family Phocinidae, and they are all odontocetes, meaning that they are toothed whales, as opposed to the mysticetes, which have baleen. And like I mentioned before, their closest relatives are narwhals and belugas, not the actual dolphins that we talked about a little while ago. So I'm going to discuss a few of the differences between harbor porpoises and Dall's porpoise, and then actually mention this guy right here, the vaquita. And these are more or less to scale. You can see the vaquita is the smallest of all of these. And the vaquita is a critically endangered species, and one that's near and dear to my heart because, as Teresa mentioned, I do spend some time working as a naturalist in the Baja area, on the Baja Peninsula. And so this species is found up in the Gulf of California, what used to be called the Sea of Cortez. And so we'll talk a little bit about that guy. So here's the harbor porpoise, our guy that we have out my window and in many places around Cook Inlet. Not all over, but they can be seen. You just have to really look with a discerning eye. And I just realized that I forgot to put in a slide about something that hopefully Teresa will mention or ask me about towards the end, which is a post that we had from the Alaska Beluga Monitoring Program a Facebook page recently about when people are looking for beluga whales, they actually might be, and a few have seen harbor porpoises. So keep your eyes peeled when you're looking for belugas, also for harbor porpoises. And I will mention later at the end when we can bring up that site on the Facebook page, if you'd like, and talk a little bit more about that. But let me right now say, before I forget, that my students and I, through the Semester by the Bay program, have been monitoring beluga whales for the last 10 years or so up in Turnagain Arm. And it was, I'm trying to remember right now if it was the second year that we were doing so, because we had a student who enjoyed himself so much the first time in Semester by the Bay that he actually came back for the second year of it. And he and several other students, and I and the other instructor, Mark Weber, with whom I do a lot of this work. And he actually is the one who got me really started working with harbor porpoises here in Kachemak Bay, because he has worked on them with others in San Francisco Bay for quite a while. In any case, we were looking at belugas. It was September, and we were seeing quite a few belugas. And this one student, Stephen, and I could have sworn we saw a harbor porpoise. And at the time, Mark and several others, and then when we mentioned it to a few other people with National Marine Fisheries Services, they all kind of said, yeah, I doubt it. It was probably a seal, or you probably saw something else. And we didn't get a picture, but we could have sworn we saw a harbor porpoise. And then again, we saw one too, the next day when we were out looking for beluga whales. And then the next season when we were out, we got a photo of one. And then since then, so this was about 10 years ago, since then we've been seeing quite a few more harbor porpoises. And we're still talking, maybe 1 or 2 the season along when we go out there over the course of a couple of months looking for belugas. So that being said, other people have started to see them too. So they seem to be making a resurgence into that part of Turnagain Arm in any case. So you can see these guys here, actually, even though what we see at the surface is mostly just this dark gray dorsal area and the dorsal fin, they are actually quite beautiful underneath and on their flanks or sides, with the lateral and belly or ventral portion having spectacled patterns that we can use for photo identification purposes, along with scars and other sorts of markings. But we've had, unfortunately, a few of these guys through the stranding network here in Homer. And when you get very close to one and examine its skin, the pattern on its skin is really complex and really beautiful. So they aren't just these very, fast moving torpedo shaped gray, boring sort of marine mammals. They're actually really quite stunning when you look at them closely. As well as having, various features here up by their rostrum, along their lips, and down towards their pectoral fins. So I think they're really beautiful. And they are approximately 1.5 to 2 meters long and only weigh about 50 to 70 kilograms in comparison to some of the others like the Dall's porpoise. They do live about 10 to 11 years. However, we kind of think of them as having lives in the fast lane because they reproduce for a relatively short period of time. And we'll look at that and talk about that a little bit more later. But in general, males are smaller than females, and that, along with their life history and their reproductive cycle, has been the focus of a great deal of research recently in the last few years. So when we compare these guys side by side, again, here's the Dall's porpoise and the Harbor porpoise. Again, very similar in some ways, but very different in others. And so we see the, I have some range maps coming up in a minute that show the differences and where they're found, but the Dall's porpoises are just in the North Pacific, and the Harbor porpoises are kind of throughout intermittently in the Northern Hemisphere, in the Black and Baltic Seas, as well as in the Pacific and the Atlantic. So there are 2 species of Dall's, 3 subspecies of Harbor porpoises. And the Dall's porpoises in general tend to be a bit more offshore, off the continental shelf, although they will be in bays like Resurrection Bay. They tend to just be a little bit deeper water species. And as the name implies, Harbor porpoises tend to be more coastal, closer to harbors and other areas where humans reside. And even though we've done lots of surveys over the years looking for them in deeper water, there have been very few sightings offshore. We don't know a whole lot about the social structure and group dynamics in either of these 2 species. Dall's porpoises tend to be in small groups, but sometimes you can see them in really large aggregations. Harbor porpoises, we hardly ever see them in groups of more than, like, on average, I'd say 1 to 5, sometimes 2 to 4, maybe 6. But here in the Kachemak Bay area, I've been on boats 4 times, I think now, in 2 different fall seasons, in September, late September and October, where we saw at the surface at any point in time, with everyone counting around us, at least 50 to 60 at the surface. So, and that's not taking into account, of course, how many were below the surface and not being seen at the time. So aggregations, between 50 to 100 are possible. They do occur, but we don't know exactly why. We assume it's either for mating purposes or for food, in which case we also oftentimes see a lot of other species there that are feeding in that area too. So that's one of the areas of research that we're hoping to examine soon. Like I said, Dall's porpoise tend to interact with boats and are very fast moving, and Harbor porpoises, when they come to the surface, except in mating instances, they tend to be a little bit slower at the surface, but still not spend a whole lot of time at the harbors, at the surface, and shy. So one of the interesting things about these 2 is that there have been some recent sightings and strandings of individuals that are hybrids between the 2. And all the different hybrid cases so far indicate that the father was a harbor porpoise and the mother or female was a Dall's porpoise. And so as you can see here, this individual has a combination of both. And genetics revealed that it was a hybrid of a harbor porpoise and a Dall's porpoise. So when we look at the distributions, again, like I mentioned, the harbor porpoises are found throughout the Black and Baltic Seas and throughout parts of the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so much of the work that recently has been done on harbor porpoise and harbor porpoise acoustics and photo ID work and such has been in Scandinavia and has been in Greenland and also parts of Alaska and then down like in California, well, like I was mentioning in San Francisco. In Alaska, as you can see here, harbor porpoises are pretty much found throughout our coastlines, out the Aleutian chain, and as far north as the Beaufort Sea. They might actually extend beyond that current range with climate change. But you can see that in Cook Inlet, I apologize, that arrow is a little bit off, but in Cook Inlet, our number is, the estimate for the population is only about 450 individuals for all of Cook Inlet. So that's a pretty small number. Why? We're not sure. And that's some of the information I will be presenting here in a minute. But we see that there's, about 17,000 in Southeast, about 40,000 in the Gulf of Alaska, and about 7,000 if you combine the areas over here in the West, the whole Western range, including the Aleutians. When we look at the Dall's porpoise, again, you can see that there's quite a bit of overlap, including we do occasionally get sightings of Dall's porpoise in Kachemak Bay and in Cook Inlet. They're infrequent, but they're around. We had a couple, unfortunately, strand a few years back. So, and people were sighting them prior to the stranding event. And some of the strandings were on the other side of the bay of Kachemak Bay, and some were around the corner closer to Anchor Point. So we know that they occasionally do run through the waters around here as well. But you can see the overlap just in Alaska, and then down through in the worldwide distribution. You can see that the overlap with harbor porpoises and Dall's porpoises continues, and we do see those hybrids down here, mostly off the Washington coast. All right, I did say I wanted to mention the vaquita, and I just think this is one of the most beautiful animals on the planet. They are called the panda of the sea for a variety of reasons, partially because of that black ring around its eye and around its lips, but also in some ways because, like the panda, it really requires our immediate action if it is possible to be saved. Unfortunately, I do see in the chat that somebody, said there are approximately 15 vaquitas left, correct? Actually, we think the number right now might be lower than 15. We're estimating hopefully 30, but the number is quite possibly around 7 or 10. We don't really know. Efforts that have been taken recently to try and save the vaquita have failed, and it's unfortunately too much for me to go into now. I'm happy to discuss it more at the end if we have time, or in a separate presentation. But Tom Jefferson, one of the people that we work with extensively, and Mark Weber does specifically, he has been working on the vaquita for quite a while, and he gave a presentation in our class a few weeks ago. And it doesn't look good for these guys. We might see this species go extinct here in the next few years. If you're interested in getting involved, you can go to the website for the Viva Vaquita. There's also an International Save the Vaquita Day every July. It's usually around the 4th of July. I'm not sure when it will be this year or in 2021. But stay tuned for that. We usually do an event. This past year it was virtual, but typically at Islands and Ocean Visitor Center in Homer, we do a International Save the Vaquita Day event over the course of the whole day. So if you're interested, we'd love to have you. Okay, so now for quite a bit, I'm going to, just want to check my time here. Okay, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about this paper by Kim Sheldon and several other authors that was published in 2014 using a variety of data that went up and through 2012. So I apologize, there's quite a few words, including the figure legends and images that you'll see on the next few slides, but I wanted to take you through information that we have on harbor porpoises chronologically and to give you a glimpse of what we do know. And you'll soon see that what we do know is actually not a whole lot. So there are 3 or 4 distinct subspecies, and in the area that you see right here, this shows the region of the 3 Alaska stocks of harbor porpoises. So we have a southeast stock, at Gulf of Alaska stock, which includes Cook Inlet, and then the Bering Sea stock. And the Cook Inlet stock is managed as part, like I said, of the Gulf of Alaska stock. And the information that we have with regard to occurrences in Cook Inlet prior to surveys that were conducted regularly beginning in the mid-1900s or so, were primarily from archaeological data, from midden sites, and from anecdotal reports. And then we do now, in the last, well, since the 50s, mostly in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, have had some systematic surveys. So you can see here that the anecdotal sightings of harbor porpoises and these are often too from surveys that were out looking for other species, fur seals, other marine mammals, beluga whales, seabirds. And so whenever porpoises or other species are sighted, they are noted in those locations as well. And so you can just see that they're not found all over Cook Inlet by any means. So until about 600 AD, we knew that harbor porpoises were quite evident in the Alutiiq Eskimo subsistence midden sites and in some of the Dena'ina and Chugach Alutiiq midden sites too. So where we had naturalists. Also in the 1800s and early 1900s, there was rarely, if ever, a mention of any of those expeditions of harbor porpoise sightings, except, like I was saying a while back in the 50s, for fur seal investigators, they did also collect cetacean sightings. And when they were noting all the different cetaceans that they saw looking for fur seals, they didn't report any harbor porpoises in Cook Inlet. I should say, I'm sorry, the HAPO is an abbreviation for harbor porpoise. So wherever you see HAPO, or if I accidentally say HAPO, I'm talking about harbor porpoises. So for about 1,500 years, we knew of harbor porpoise sightings primarily from Native Alaskan societies and subsistence societies. This image on the left is just to show you some of the landmarks and water features that Sheldon et al. Mention in their text, in their publication. And that might help us to understand where some of their prey and therefore some of the harbor porpoise distributions occur. With one exception of an entanglement in Upper Cook Inlet in 1956, basically we didn't have any information on sightings or strandings in Cook Inlet until the mid-1970s. And so that's why, again, when I mentioned about 10 years ago that we thought we saw harbor porpoises in Turnagain Arm over here, people were really surprised and skeptical, thinking we must have seen something else. But now, if you notice over here in these stranding reports, you can see here that looking at the stranding reports of harbor porpoises in Cook Inlet from 56 to 2010, again, they're quite low, which is a good thing. You don't necessarily want a lot of strandings of harbor porpoises, but it also is an indicator that there likely aren't too many porpoises to begin with. Live or dead and stranded in the regions. And so in all of these different areas that you see identified over here as, by letters A through K, and Homer being J right there, we see in Homer there are a few instances, and probably more so in the Homer area than in other regions. Oh, did I pass one? Nope, sorry. Okay. All right, so now looking at some systematic surveys that were done by NOAA, like I mentioned, not just for marine mammals, but also for seabirds, and specifically in recent years in particular, in conjunction with beluga whale surveys, aerial surveys and shore-based surveys, as well as occasionally some, not for belugas necessarily, but vessel-based surveys for other species too. Those different types of surveys increased throughout the 70s and up until recently, and are still occurring as often as funding would provide it. Obviously, most of you are aware that Cook Inlet is a large, difficult, often to maneuver through body of water. And so undertaking a survey in this area, anywhere around here, not even just in Kachemak Bay, but throughout Cook Inlet, is challenging for a variety of reasons, and it's very expensive. So on one of the earlier slides, I showed the status in terms of endangered, like the vaquita being critically endangered and some of the other species being threatened. The harbor porpoises, in terms of their global distribution, are not threatened, thank goodness. But that also means that there isn't much money usually available to study them. And so we simply, because they're so elusive, we don't really know a whole lot about them other than information that has been collected from other surveys. So in 91, there was a dedicated harbor porpoise aerial survey, and that estimate provided us with approximately 136 individuals, but it didn't include the shoreline and many of the bays throughout Cook Inlet, which is interesting because, as you know, harbor porpoises are pretty coastal. They spend a lot of their time near the shore. So that didn't look at a lot of the areas where they likely were. And then in 98, there was a beluga aerial survey conducted in June, and the uncorrected abundance was 249. And this was, again, based on offshore sightings while they were looking for belugas. So incidental reports while looking for belugas of harbor porpoises. You can see down here the two different figures, 13 and 12. In 12, you see that from 1993 to up until 2012, when this this report that Kim Sheldon et al. Published on terminated. So these are National Marine Mammal Lab data that were collected in Cook Inlet during aerial surveys. And you can see that, you know, there were different numbers cited across these years, but even in 2012, only 8 were spotted, and in some years, none, or very low numbers. So again, it's, I think, in many instances, a matter of being in the right place at the right time, or even being able to see them when they pop up very briefly at the surface. Excuse me. And these are all the different locations marked across years with different symbols where these individuals were observed. This area, this slide is mostly one that I use for my students to show that how you survey for marine mammals makes a lot of difference, right? So this first one over here from 97, in November of 97 through August of 79, you can see that a lot of the survey effort was really just kind of random. So when you try to actually do a survey for scientific purposes with funding, say from NOAA or for other agencies, often in many instances you do what's called a line transect, or you survey something very systematically, like you can see over here on the far right. So the middle upper figure is from 82 to 83, where they surveyed parts of upper and lower Cook Inlet. And over on the right-hand side, this was just for 2 days, August 1st and 2nd in August of 1991. And you can see that this relatively extensive survey, again, though you're doing line transects with observers very specifically looking for harbor porpoises in this case. In this image at the very bottom, you can see it was kind of a combination of the two, a little bit of very dedicated line transect surveys, but also a few that were just kind of moving around in areas where, you know, you likely would expect to see them. So notice that, for example, the image here in the middle, in the upper right in the middle, really didn't take into account any of the areas that we're going to be talking about right now, which is in Halibut Cove Lagoon over here on the inside of Kachemak Bay, or outside the Homer Spit in the area behind Eldridge Passage. Okay, and we're just about done with all of the wordy and data-rich slides here. But again, in this paper by Sheldon et al., we see that the largest abundance estimate was for 428, which is why on that early map we had about 450 for harbor porpoises. This was during a seabird survey that was conducted in Lower Cook Inlet and in the summer of 1993. So this is where we've gotten one of our sort of highest abundance estimates for this area. And basically, though, again, we have to take into account there's so many difficulties that go into studying something like a marine mammal, and let alone if it's a humpback whale, let alone something very small and elusive like a harbor porpoise. So the area that you have to cover, the amount of effort, the amount of money, the type of platform, the research platform, are you paying, to fly a helicopter or a fixed wing aircraft, or are you doing something on a really large research vessel or on a small, more of like a water taxi style type boat? The whole study design, some of those line transects or happenstance sort of surveys in areas where you are expecting to see them. All of this basically has to be taken into account when we consider the abundance estimate and the numbers that we get at the end of the day. So since 2000, we also have a few other things that we need to consider, and things moving forward in our area here, at least outside Cook Inlet, or excuse me, outside Kachemak Bay in Lower Cook Inlet, including seismic exploration. So right now, something else that was brought up in this paper and is something that I'll show you a little bit more about towards the very end of the presentation has to do with trying to just catalog all of the marine mammals that use the Lower Cook Inlet, but specifically Kachemak Bay area, because of potential detriment to the way in which these animals survive. So using echolocation and communication in general underwater when the environment is very noisy. So since 2000, as the list explains there, the Port of Anchorage has expanded. It is continually being worked on. That is heavily monitored, for example, for belugas, but also other species like harbor porpoises that use that area. And we know now, I was actually emailing the other day with Kim herself, and she reminded me that a few people who were doing acoustic studies and some photo ID work of belugas, and they have hydrophones in the area around J-Bear, are picking up harbor porpoise calls as well. So even when it's ice covered and we don't see them there, we know they're there. We can tell by their signatures that they are in that area. And so keeping an eye out for them during times when there's a lot of pile driving going on, a lot of underwater noise being generated, potential to build a bridge, mining operations, other infrastructure related to that across Cook Inlet, for example, with the proposed pebble mine infrastructure that would have to go in on the other side of Cook Inlet around here, hydrokinetic energy, oil and gas seismic exploration, and then not to mention just all of the water quality effects from not only all of those activities, but even just runoff from urban areas. So really we just, I'm not sure if you can see that terribly well, but at the bottom of the slide, it explains that the effect that this all might have on harbor porpoises in Cook Inlet really just can't be determined until we know what we're dealing with, until we understand the genetics of these individuals, the demographics, where they're spending time, which areas they're using, because it is such a highly mobile and cryptic species. There's a lot to still be known about this species before we can even begin to take into account all the potential effects that some of these operations might have on their distribution. So let me glance at my time here. Oh, I have a few minutes to wrap up here before questions. So I just wanted to quickly point out and tell you a little bit about a study that we've recently begun in Halibut Cove Lagoon. So if you are not familiar with Halibut Cove, so this is Halibut Cove here. Homer would be up off the screen up above in the upper left corner of this map. And Halibut Cove Lagoon, if you've been to Grewing Glacier on the Saddle Trail, this is the area tucked back in here to the west of Grewing Glacier. And so this area is just an amazing spot for a variety of reasons. We go in there with our students regularly and conduct photo identification projects of harbor porpoises. And you can see here that this individual has a couple of obvious pigmentations and pockmarks on it that could be used, not to mention potentially a little nick right there on the dorsal fin. But we also see a great deal of harbor seals and sea otters and bears and some other wildlife in the area too. So this area to be studied has unfolded a variety of potential projects for us, including some acoustic work that we're hoping to do soon, as well as some more photo ID work, potentially with more human observers on vessels, on kayaks from shore, and potentially with drones. So these are just some of the images that we've taken in the lagoon. And here you can see a harbor porpoise popping up right in between two sea otters. But this is a typical image that we get. But luckily we have had a great deal of funding from the Kenai Peninsula College and Martha Briscoe, who have generously donated to the work that we do with the students. And so we've been able to acquire, I think at this point we have 5 or 6 really nice telephoto cameras that are the same ones that other researchers use, say for identifying beluga whales and killer whales and humpback whales. And so we've been able to start a photo ID catalog of these harbor porpoises that seem to be almost always, I think we've only gone into the lagoon once where we haven't seen harbor porpoises. And there are other areas, again, like where we see them too, around Gull Island and, like I mentioned, in Eldridge Passage. But here we can see mother and calf, which we've seen a few mother and calf pairs, which is great to know that they are reproducing. And we see some other events, like in this case here. Up until recently, harbor porpoise mating efforts have been suspected but not confirmed. And there's actually a Russian paper from, oh gosh, I can't remember the date right now, but I believe it's the 1930s that documents this. And then really nothing much until folks off the San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge, and in a few other locations started to notice that every time they were seeing any aerial activity or surface behavior other than just simply surfacing for a breath. These guys are often called puffing pigs because if it's very quiet, like in the lagoon and the engines are turned off, you hear them when they exhale at the surface and they literally sound sort of like a grunting pig. So they've been commonly referred to as puffing pigs for a long time. But so you see them come up and you hear them, and that's about it. But we were seeing much of this sort of aerial behavior. And then there were 2 instances. I know these are not great images, but believe me, when we look at them and with a lot of manipulation of photo contrast and color contrast, and then in San Francisco and other places, they've actually seen the penis of the male. The male always approaches the female on the left-hand side. And we have now, there's a great deal of work done by Deborah Boege and others showing that this is a lateralized mating behavior, and the male and female reproductive tracts have evolved in a manner to facilitate this activity. So if you see activity like this, any sort of aerial behavior of harbor porpoises, I definitely would love an email, or I'll show you in a minute our website where you can tell us about that. Or if you have any photos, share those with us, please. So anyways, here's some individuals, and you can hopefully, I am like running out of time here, so I'm going to quickly whiz through these last few slides, but hopefully you can see these beautiful patterns on this individual and some of these other marks on these individuals. And we actually have had some resighting events. And so this individual here, you can see these marks as well. This one here, these couple of little slash marks over there, also from a different perspective. And then just about a year later, the same individual. So it matched up very nicely. And we've had 3, I think, individuals now where we have resighted them. And again, we use various types of markings on their dorsal fin or on the dorsal surface of the animal. So what you can do, and we would really appreciate it, is we have started, there's been a website created by Ginger Moore years ago for humpback whales that was called K-Bay Whales. We have now updated that and changed it to be K-Bay Marmam, which is abbreviation for marine mammals. And there's a large society global in the US, but it's the Society for Marine Mammalogy. And so many people who study marine mammals know of Marmam. And so this is kbaymarmam.com. And if you go to that website, you will see our homepage, the landing page, which is right over here on the right. And we're hoping right now we have a really terrific humpback whale catalog in there that has started, but we're also hoping to add different pages for harbor porpoises, as well as killer whales and other species too, like fin whales. And so what you can do is send any pictures or other information like you see here, name, date, specific location, or number of whales nearby. And we're hoping to have a student develop an app soon that will drop a pin and give us the lat long of your photo and where you cited that individual. So I will quickly, just if I have a second, take you to that website, which is actually up over here. Move this over here. So this is our website, and you can just go through and submit a photo or look at our ID catalog, which is really fun to do if you're into humpback whales, for example. It tells you how to take a picture and what we're looking for, and you can look at any one of these, W, X, Y, and Z whales and see if you can match some of your humpbacks that you have seen in the past, or click on any one of the catalogs and print it out, or look through and try and match up whales you've seen. And then, like I've said, we're hoping to have other pages soon for other marine mammal species. But this is the email address, kbaymarmam@gmail.com, that you can go to. And please, of course, make sure you always follow NOAA viewing guidelines and regulations, and check that out if you're not certain what those are. But try and stay away. A good rule of thumb is at least a football field length away from marine mammals. If they approach you, especially with your engine turned off, that's under their control, but you should not approach them closer than that. So I will quickly jump back to my presentation and just thank everybody who has been involved in all of this research, especially Bay Excursions and Martha Briscoe and the Kenai Peninsula College and so many other people in California that we work with as well. And then I will turn it over to Teresa so she can wrap things up here. Thank you very much.
Hi, Deb, this is Teresa. I just want to cover a couple of questions that came up in the chat, and there was one about the approximately 15 vaquitas left. I think you answered that question. Another question though was, is there any indication whether the doll and Harbor Porpoise hybrids are viable?
We don't know for sure yet, but they seem to, as hybrids themselves, be fine, be viable themselves, but whether or not they can successfully reproduce and have offspring in the next generation, we're not certain.
Okay. And then the next question was, how do they get population estimates over such a broad geographic area? I think that question came up before you covered a lot of your information about exactly how they do that. So if there is a further question on that, Doug, it could throw it up there. And then the vaquitas, why are the numbers so low? Somebody put in there that the Mexican fisheries are part of it, but do they know why they're so low and what happened?
Yes, unfortunately, it's a really sad story. So the Tuataba, there's essentially a demand for the swim bladder thought to in a fish. And so there's a fisheries, not just for that one fish, but specifically for that fish. And it's gotten to be as bad as, if not worse than the drug cartels in parts of Mexico for illegal drugs. And so these fish and those areas and the types of nets that they use to get those fish, primarily for, traditional medicine and Yeah, I don't, I don't want to go down that bunny hole too much. Unfortunately, it's a sad state, but some of the fisheries, of course, are necessary. The folks there, that is their livelihood. They need to be able to fish to feed themselves and to feed their families. But some of the fisheries are illegal, and the vaquita gets caught in the gill nets from those fisheries, and they target the fish species in some of the same areas where the vaquitas are. And so it's gone, the Mexican government has really tried very hard and worked internationally with others to try and stop this in time to prevent the extinction of the species. But I think it unfortunately might have started a little too late. Okay. And captivity right now doesn't seem to be a viable option either. So far, the few that they've caught to try and bring into captivity to see if they could start a population in captivity in case they do go extinct in that area, they have died.
And then Doug clarified his question. His specific question was, how do they do the surveys in like the Bering Sea and the Aleutian population for those estimates?
There are large vessels that are often out for, again, for other reasons. They wouldn't necessarily be out for just harbor porpoise surveys, or I'm not aware of any that have specifically gone out for that. But NOAA and Fish and Wildlife Service, and even, you know, I know like the Refuge here, the TECLA goes out quite often with Fish and Wildlife Service. And so in many instances, any species like that, not just harbor porpoises, but they're noted, and then they would compile those data over the course of the year from all the different boats from the different regions. There are aerial surveys that do take place sometimes as well when they're flying, let's say, to look for walrus colonies or other species. But yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a really large data set that many agencies and people contribute to, and they do their best guess to pull that all together and get a population estimate.
Okay. And then somebody just asked, do the harbor porpoises follow salmon into Turnagain Arm and Knik Arm like the belugas do?
We think so. There have been a couple of instances, one that I was involved with, of necropsies of harbor porpoises that have died seemingly because they swallowed a fish that was too big. They couldn't, so it was stuck in their pharynx or in the beginning of their esophagus, and likely, well, in the one instance that we did, it was asphyxiated, so it couldn't breathe properly. And so yes, we think so. We don't really know for sure exactly, but there have been many stranding reports and evidence in their stomach content analyses have showed that they do eat salmon and some of the other same species that belugas eat.
Okay, and then backing up to the earlier portion of the presentation was how to tell the difference between belugas calves and harbor porpoises. Is it really that just the dorsal fin, or?
Well, let's see here. Let me go quickly to that, see if I still have it open. Here we go. So this is the article. If you haven't, I'm still sharing, right? Still screen sharing?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So this was something that was put on the AKBMP Facebook page, and maybe some of you saw this, looking for essentially the, how to spot the difference between a harbor porpoise and a beluga whale. But yes, in many instances, so the main thing I would say, if you're looking at a beluga calf versus a harbor porpoise, it would be, you wouldn't see a harbor porpoise likely swimming that close to a beluga whale. You could, but more likely than not, if you see a dark, small, porpoise-like looking marine mammal swimming right next to a white beluga whale, it's probably a beluga calf. And then the shape of the dorsal fin, of course, so the presence of the dorsal fin and the shape of the dorsal fin, much more so than that just ridge that you would see on a beluga whale, and the absence of the actual fin itself. So in most cases, when you see a harbor porpoise, the first and only thing you see sometimes is that dorsal fin. And so And then the melon, the head region is a little bit less bulbous, a little less round and sort of peanut shaped sometimes than in a harbor porpoise than in a beluga whale.
Okay. And then do harbor porpoises, like, could I expect to see them on the Kenai? Do they go up rivers?
Yes, yes. So you will see harbor porpoises occasionally move upriver, especially if they are chasing prey. And so they're quite common in estuaries. How far upriver they go, I'm not sure what the actual anecdotal or scientific maximum extent of a freshwater body has been. I'd have to look into that to know for sure, but we do know that they go into brackish water and up into estuaries.
And then another question just came up, said, do they use echolocation to navigate in silty, muddy water and for feeding?
Yes, definitely. So they rely on their echolocation extensively, and because they are in those near shore environments, oftentimes, like you asked, in silty or muddy water, they rely heavily on that echolocation ability. They also communicate with one another with very high frequencies. And so oftentimes if you have a hydrophone out that is looking for, I see the question that just came in about acoustic recordings and what do they sound like. I could actually play some for you if we have more time to stick around, but if we need to end, I can certainly also post something or ask Teresa to post something later. But their high frequency sounds are very less whistle-like and a little bit more echolocation click-like, click trains, but they're also at very high frequencies. So unfortunately, a lot of the hydrophones that are out for other species like beluga whales and killer whales, they are often not in, they're above that frequency range. They do produce some sounds in the lower frequency range that will be picked up by hydrophones and recordings that are out there for other species. But many of the sounds that they produce are higher than that. And so we miss a lot of their calls with a traditional hydrophone setup. That being said, there were some hydrophones that were put out last fall due to the seismic testing that was going on in Lower Cook Inlet, and there will be a report coming out soon on that and the different sounds that they heard and didn't hear during and after the seismic testing that was going on. So I'm not sure that I can report any more on that right now, but they did detect harbor porpoises in that area around the corner from Seldovia. And we know from photo ID work too that they are there, but the sounds were absent during the testing months or weeks and then returned after it stopped.
If you have the sound, we can stay on for a minute more. I would just say thank you to everybody. If you need to jump off, if you have a minute, could you put in the chat where you're from so that we can just so that we can see where everybody came from. We're very interested to see how far out our reach is in terms of these programs. But yes, Dr. Tobin, if you have the sound, we'll be happy to stay on for that.
Okay. And thank you. I also saw one other question there about the sounds. Yes, they're out of our hearing range. Most of them, not all of them, but most of the sounds are out of our hearing range. So let's see. I'm just going to take you to Dositz. It's probably the fastest, easiest place. If you're not familiar with this is Discovery of Sound in the Sea. It's a fantastic website that has all sorts of amazing information and sounds of various different types of, you can see my recent searches, harbor porpoises. So this will, all right, wind turbine, seismic air guns. So some of the different pile driving and others. But let's look at the sounds of harbor porpoises. So, and I don't know if you can read them, it's rather small, but it says the harbor porpoise echolocation clicks originally recorded on a tagged porpoise during a prey capture experiment. Listening, you can hear some clicks, then a series of faster clicks, which is that buzz sound, that kind of terminal buzz, and you can see it too. And then around the time of capture, after capturing the fish, the porpoise goes back to slower clicking, and then note that the sound has been modified to be audible to the human ear. Thus, what you hear when you listen is the real rate at which the porpoise made the clicks, but not the actual clicks, which are ultrasonic. So that came from Woods Hole. And then there's information there about them as well, and underwater acoustic alarms, different types of pingers on nets to try and deter porpoises and other species from entanglement. And you know, there was, I had one or two other sites up earlier that I was reading, which were really great. Hang on, I have to find them. They had some, here it is. Nope, here. Nope, sorry. I'm sorry, I'm here. This was something that I was discussing with Teresa and somebody else in my marine biology class the other day. So this is a really interesting article in American Scientist that came out not too long ago. That same photograph or photographer that I used in my picture is the one who captured these images as well. And so this is talking a lot about the different types of sounds that harbor porpoises make and how they actually perceive their underwater environment. So I will go ahead and really quickly put that in the chat. And let me put that there for everyone. And if you are interested, you can go check out that that article there about, it's quite a long, interesting article all about harbor porpoise. I don't think they have a recording in here though. Oh, well, they show you what it looks like and how they make the sounds, which again, I'd be happy to go through some other time. And this is, well, it's a 10-second long clip. So that particular individual was trained to detect a certain density, a certain type of material that was inside those spheres. And then as you can see, its eyes were covered up. So it only could use its echolocation to detect the differences between those two spheres that were here floating. So this one and this one, but they had different contents. And so you can see him moving his head back and forth and then correctly choosing the one that he was supposed to select. So anyway, very, very interesting. I used to work with bottlenose dolphins in semi-captive environments and captive environments, and can tell you that they would notify people when they were pregnant before they knew they were pregnant. And if you, once in a while, I would swim with, you know, something dense in my hand, like a quarter, and they would go nuts, like trying to figure out what was inside your hand because they knew it was something different than the rest of the soft tissue or bone that they could pick up with their echolocation. So anyway, just a little anecdote there.
That is absolutely amazing. I've loved everything about your presentation. Thank you so much.
Very welcome. That was very fun.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate you tuning in and support AWA with all the great work that they do. Thank you, Teresa, very much for hosting.
Thank you.
And if anybody has any any questions for me specifically, I will put my email address in the chat as well. So you're welcome to contact me, shoot me an email. And I thought I saw one private chat here. I want to make sure that I didn't miss anybody. If somebody messaged me, I didn't see it until it flashed up very briefly. But anyway, I'm not seeing it right now. So if you try to reach out independently, just let me know, and or shoot me an email and we can correspond off the video. Yeah, oh wait, there it was. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Charles, I see a message. And if you want, I can quickly look at this or answer this. I know we're out of time, but it basically, Charles' question says, so why do harbor porpoises beach themselves? And he asked about the pilot whales in New Zealand at Farewell Spit, do it in huge numbers, often caught at flood tide and cannot exit shallows. I'm happy to talk with you, Charles, outside of this. That's something we don't know enough about, and there's a variety of hypotheses and potential explanations for that. Pilot whales in particular, but other species like harbor porpoises and such. And in many instances, it involves their hearing apparatus being damaged, and that could be due to an infection. Many people, some, because they're such social species, they'll follow each other onto the beaches. And then, but it also could be damaged due to, say, seismic testing or other types of noises in the underwater environment. But there's a variety of potential explanations for that, sadly. And let's see one other new message. Oh, okay, thanks, Dixie. Yeah, Dixie was interested in that too. Yeah, they do suck fish in rather than grab them with their teeth. So Doug just mentioned that. Yeah, so this is really interesting too. So there's a variety of species that do this. And in fact, I'm supposed to talk about that next week in class, in my marine biology class. So they will create a pressure difference. And so when dolphins and porpoises grab fish, they first suck them in. And then when you see them biting them, they actually usually just use their teeth to maneuver the fish so that it's oriented head first. And so they can, because they swallow it whole, they don't chew them up before they swallow them whole. But yes, they do create, we'll have to go into the physics of all of that with Bernoulli's equation and so forth, but they create a little bit of a pressure differences, and they suck the fish in and then manipulate it and swallow it whole. So I'm sorry, I went on and on. I keep saying I'm going to stop, but you guys have great questions. I just keep on going.
They are great questions. I haven't even stopped recording yet because I think other people are going to be very interested in the questions and the answers. So I could too, Dixie.
Well, thanks everyone. This has been really fun. I do, if I could put in a tiny little plug, I do offer a 1-credit class through the college called Marine Mammals of Alaska. And we're going to offer that this spring semester via Zoom because of COVID and everything going on. So if anybody's interested in that, you can also reach out or check the KBC website. So it's a fun class where we look at all the different types of marine mammals, both in the water and the nearshore environment.
Very nice. Okay, Deb, I think I'm going to stop recording now.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Stay healthy. Wear your mask.